My name is Claire Mitchell, and at my mother's birthday dinner, my family told me in front of a stranger that I was nothing. It was during dessert. Marcus, my brother, was trying to impress his new girlfriend and decided to use me as entertainment. But it was my father who delivered the final blow. The words echoed in my head like a slap. But when the phone rang at 8:47 that night and my father's boss asked to speak to Mrs. Mitchell, no one was prepared to find out who I really was. I'm Claire Mitchell, 28, and I've always been the different kid in my family. Not in the romantic sense you see in movies, where being different is interesting or admirable. In my case, being different meant being seen as problematic. I grew up in a house where things had their natural place. Marcus, my older brother, had the gift of gab and the gift of gab to sell anything. Jake had been fixing engines since he was 12, and his hands always smelled of oil and skill. Me? I read books. When other teenagers were discovering parties or first jobs, I was in the Cedar Falls City Library, dreaming of glass offices, big meetings, projects that would change things. My mother said I was living on the moon. My father would shake his head and mutter something about dreams that don't pay the bills. They weren't mean, they were practical. A hardworking family from Iowa, where a person's worth was measured by the sweat on their brow and the dollars at the end of the month. I had chosen a path they couldn't see, and that made me, in their eyes, someone who thought I was better than everyone else. Maybe I really did find myself.
Our
Or
house was on
maybe
Elm
I just
Street,
wanted
a
more.
quiet street where everyone had known each other for decades. Neighbors who shared tools, children who played on the sidewalk late into the night, the sound of lawnmowers on Saturdays. It was the kind of place where people took pride in knowing their place in the world. My father, Robert Mitchell, has worked at Midwest Logistics for 15 years. He was a shift supervisor, responsible, punctual, the kind of man who woke up at 5 in the morning without complaining and considered it a virtue. To him, work was tangible. Boxes moved, trucks loaded, goals met. My mother, Linda, made our home our universe. Lunches were always ready, clothes were always washed, bills were always organized. She had this ability to make our lower middle class life seem abundant. Even when money was tight, the table was set, the food was good, and the family was together. Marcus has always been the social whiz in his family. At 32, he sells cars at the local dealership, and he's good at it. He has the kind of charisma that makes people buy things they don't need and then leave thanking him. Jake, the middle one, is a mechanic, and a respected one at that. People line up to have their cars fixed because Jake knows about engines. And then there was me, the youngest, who instead of learning something useful, decided to study business administration. The jokes started early. When I was 16 and talking about wanting to work for a big company, Marcus would laugh. Claire wants to be an executive. She'll boss everyone around from her office. The family would laugh along as if it were some adorable childhood fantasy. When I graduated from state college, the first in my family to earn a degree, I expected some kind of recognition. Instead, I heard, "Now you're going to see what real life is like, daughter." As if the 4 years of studying, internships, and sleepless nights
My first
were just
job
a
was as an
rehearsal for the
administrative
real thing.
assistant at an accounting firm. The pay was modest, the work was genuine, but to my family, it was just sitting around all day. When I tried to explain the reports I was putting together, the clients I was serving, the systems I was learning to use, their eyes would glaze over with polite boredom. "That's great, honey," my mother would say as she washed the dishes. "Just remember that real work is different." Jake was more direct. "You don't produce anything, Claire. You just push paper around." I tried to argue, to explain that companies needed organization, planning, strategy. But for them, that was just talk from someone who had never got their hands dirty. I learned to keep quiet during these conversations. It was easier than trying to translate my world into a language they could understand. Sundays were the worst. Family dinner was a sacred tradition in the Mitchell household. Marcus would come in with stories of spectacular sales, impressive numbers, commissions that make my father's eyes shine with pride. "That's my boy," he would say, clapping his son on the shoulder. Jake would tell me about the complex engines he'd fixed, the satisfied customers, the solid reputation he'd built in town. "Honest work," my mother would say, serving another slice of pie. When it was my turn to talk about the week, interest would visibly wane. If I mentioned a major project I'd overseen, someone would change the subject. If I talked about a satisfied client, I'd get a distracted, "That's great." If I shared a small promotion or recognition, the response would be polite silence followed by, "Anyone want more coffee?" It wasn't malice, it was simply disinterest, as if my professional life took place in a parallel dimension, irrelevant to the real world they about their work. To show genuine interest in my siblings' achievements, I learned to be the audience, not the protagonist. It was more comfortable for everyone that way. 6 months ago, my life changed in ways that still surprise me. David Chen, a senior manager at Sterling and Associates, offered me a position I never knew existed: regional manager of corporate consulting. Sterling and Associates provides consulting services to mid-sized and large companies throughout the Midwest. My work involves analyzing operations, identifying inefficiencies, proposing solutions, and overseeing implementation. It's complex, it's strategic, and it impacts millions of dollars in annual operations. When I got the promotion, I called home ecstatic. "Mom, I made it! I'm a regional manager." "That's wonderful, dear. What exactly does that mean?" I tried to explain. I talked about responsibilities, about the trust they had placed in me, about how it was a rare position for someone my age. She listened patiently and then said, "I'm glad you're happy, Claire. Your father will be home soon. I'll tell him." When I told him in person the following Sunday, the reaction was similar. Polite congratulations, warm smiles, and then Marcus took over the conversation by talking about a $30,000 sale he had closed that week. I didn't understand. I didn't expect parades or celebrations, but I expected interest, curiosity, some recognition that this was significant. Instead, I continued to be just Claire, who works with papers. David Chen was the first person to really see me. A 45-year-old Korean American with a solid career and a perspective that opened my eyes to possibilities I didn't even know existed. He was the one who suggested my promotion, the one who advocated my candidacy to the board. "David," he told me the day he offered the position, "you have something that many seasoned executives don't have: the ability to see entire systems and understand how people fit into them." It was the first time anyone had described my work as valuable, specialized. In my family, I was seen as someone who shied away from hard work. To David, I was someone who understood complexities that others couldn't. "You don't have to prove anything to people who have already decided not to see you," he once told me when I mentioned my family's reaction to the promotion. "Prove it to the people who matter, including yourself." The phrase stuck with me because deep down, part of me still sought their approval. I still wanted them to understand that my work had value, that my life choice was not a rejection of what they represented, but simply mine. David taught me that this might never happen, and that's okay. Today is my mother's birthday. She is 63, and as always, the family gathers for dinner at our house on Elm Street. The tradition is sacred. I arrive at 5, help in the kitchen, even though my help is dispensable, and we sit down at the table at 6 sharp. Marcus brought along Jessica, his new girlfriend, a friendly woman of about 26 who works as a manager at a local bank. She is intelligent, articulate, and clearly tries hard to make a good impression on her boyfriend's family. I noticed how everyone straightens up a little when there are visitors. Marcus tells his best stories, Jake shows off his sense of humor, my parents become slightly more performative versions of themselves. It's natural, human. We all want to be seen in our best light when there's an audience. As I help my mother finish setting the table, Jessica asks me about my work. It's a genuine question asked with real interest. I start to answer, but Marcus quickly interjects. Jessica, Claire works as a consultant. It's complicated to explain. The message is clear. It's not interesting enough to discuss. Jessica smiles politely, and the
I sit at the
conversation
table
moves
with
on
that
to other
familiar
topics.
feeling of being present and invisible. During the aperitif, I watch the family dynamics unfold, as they always do. Marcus entertains Jessica with anecdotes about eccentric clients. Jake makes jokes that get genuine laughs. My parents beam with pride as they listen to their children. There's a part of me that always hopes that maybe this time someone will ask about my new project, about the management system I implemented for a distribution company that saved $200,000 in the first quarter, about the presentation I gave to the board last week, about anything in my professional world. It's a small, almost childish hope, like a child who draws a picture and waits for someone to ask about the colors he chose. But as I listen to Marcus explain to Jessica the differences between car models, as I watch my father nod approvingly at every technical detail Jake shares about an engine, I know my turn won't come. Not because they're bad people, but because they genuinely can't see the value in what I do. For them, work is something you can touch, count, measure in physical units. My work happens in spreadsheets, presentations, meetings, strategies. It's too abstract for the concrete world we grew up in. I smile, I join in the conversation, I show interest in their issues, and I hope, as I always hope, that maybe today will be different. Dessert arrived as it always did at my mother's house. Homemade chocolate cake, fresh coffee, and that comforting feeling of family ritual. Jessica praised the recipe effusively. My mother beamed with pride. And for a moment, the table was enveloped in that warm atmosphere that made me forget why I sometimes felt out of place there. That's when Marcus decided to entertain his girlfriend. Jessica, he said, cutting a generous piece of cake, you have no idea how lucky you
He
are not
made
to have
air
to
quotes with
work
his fingers
like
as he
Claire.
said, work, and a mischievous smile flashed in his eyes. The kind of smile I'd known since I was a kid, when he was about to make a joke at my expense. My stomach tightened instantly. Not with surprise, I knew that tone, but with a familiar anxiety, the feeling that I was about to become the evening's entertainment. Jessica laughed politely, not quite getting the joke, but understanding that she was expected to find it funny. Jake looked up from his plate, already anticipating the amusement. My parents smiled in that indulgent way they did when Marcus was being Marcus. I continued cutting my cake methodically, as if I hadn't heard. But of course I had, and they knew I had. Jake, as always, was the first to take his cue from his older brother. Well, yeah, Jessica, he said, leaning back in his chair with that look of someone about to reveal an amusing secret. Claire has the easiest job in the world. She just sits around all day pretending she's busy. The word faking cut deeper than I expected. It wasn't just about questioning the difficulty of my work. It was about questioning its legitimacy, as if I were an imposter in a game of professional make-believe. Jake, I whispered, but my voice was hollow, a weak attempt at protest that died before it could even take full form. "What? It's true," he continued, now excited about his own performance. While I'm face down under a car with oil dripping on my face, and Marcus is chasing clients in the sun, Claire is in an air-conditioned room working on her computer. My mother laughed softly, not maliciously, but with that maternal indulgence she used when her children were naughty. My father shook his head in amusement, as if he were watching a harmless, familiar family sitcom. Jessica looked at me with an expression that was a mix of amusement and something that might have been pity.
Marcus, encouraged
That was
by the
worse than the
audience's
laughter.
reaction, decided to raise the level of the performance. "Anyone can do what she does," he said, gesturing with his fork as if he were giving a presentation. "Sitting at a desk, working on a computer, saying nice things in meetings. It's basically pretending to work all day." He turned to Jessica with that smile I knew so well, the smile of someone sharing an obvious family truth with an outsider. Real work is what Jake and I do. We produce real results. I sell cars, boom, money in the bank. Jake fixes engines, boom, car runs. Claire, well, Claire does stuff. The word things floated in the air like a soap bubble, insubstantial, empty, ready to burst at the slightest touch. Jessica laughed, but I could tell it was becoming more forced. She was beginning to realize this wasn't just innocent sisterly banter. There was a subtle cruelty there, an established pattern of belittling. "Marcus, stop," I said, but my voice was still weak. It was more of a request than a demand. "Stop what? I'm just explaining to Jessica how things work here." It was my father who delivered the final blow. Robert Mitchell leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, the posture he always assumed when he was about to impart fatherly wisdom. His voice had that tone of gentle authority he used when he wanted to educate without offending. "Claire has always had these ideas of grandeur," he said, addressing Jessica as if I weren't at the table. "Ever since she was little, she thought she was better than us because she studied more. But deep down, she doesn't do anything that really matters." The words, "do nothing," echoed in my head like a funeral bell. Do nothing, do nothing, do nothing. "It's not that we don't recognize her education," my mother added quickly, trying to soften the cruelty of her husband's words. "It's just that, well, office work is
Jessica was
different
now
from real
visibly
work, right?"
uncomfortable. She looked between me and the rest of the family, as if trying to understand how a conversation about dessert had turned into a public humiliation session. "You don't know anything about what I do," I managed to say, finally finding my voice. But it sounded defensive, almost childish. "We know enough," Jake countered. "You sit in meetings talking about strategies and optimizations. That's not work, that's fancy bullshit." I felt my face burn, but not from embarrassment. It was anger. A cold, crystal clear anger that started in my stomach and spread like ice through my veins. This wasn't the first time my work had been belittled. It wasn't the first time I'd sat at this table listening to jokes about my easy life. But this time was different. This time, there was a witness. A smart, professional woman who was watching my family reduce me to nothing. This time, something inside me said, "Enough." Not loudly, not as a cry of revolt or a dramatic moment of confrontation. It was a silent, cold, definitive decision, like a door closing softly, but with a lock that would never open again. I continued to eat my cake slowly, cutting small pieces with surgical precision. My breathing was controlled, my hands were steady. On the outside, I appeared calm. Inside, something fundamental had changed. "Claire, are you okay?" Jessica asked softly. It was the first time all night that someone had directed a question directly to me with genuine concern. "I'm fine," I replied, and my voice sounded surprisingly steady. "Just listening." Marcus laughed. "Claire is pouting because we're telling the truth." No, Claire was making a decision. Dinner continued as if nothing had happened. The conversation moved on to other topics: Jake's plans for the weekend, a promotion Marcus was trying to secure, my mother's spring garden preparation. I smiled at the appropriate moments. I asked the polite questions, but a part of me had completely disconnected from the table. It was as if I were watching the scene from outside my own body, watching a family that had collectively, and without conscious malice, decided that one of its members was fundamentally less valuable than the others. Jessica tried to include me in the conversation a few times. She asked about my plans for the week, commented on the weather, made kind observations about the decor of the house. I responded politely, but I could tell she was uncomfortable. She had witnessed something she shouldn't have. "The cake is delicious, Mrs. Mitchell," she said to my mother. "Thank you, dear. It's my mother-in-law's recipe. God rest her soul." Normal conversation, normal family, as if the last 15 minutes hadn't happened. But they had happened, and this time I wasn't going to pretend they hadn't. As I helped clear the dishes, I heard Marcus whisper something to Jessica in the living room. I couldn't hear the words, but the tone was explanatory, almost apologetic. Probably something like, "It's just a sibling joke," or "Claire's a little sensitive." Jessica said something quietly, and although I couldn't make out the words, her intonation suggested discomfort. She didn't like what she'd witnessed. This gave me a grim satisfaction. At least one person in the room had recognized that this was no innocent prank. When I finished putting away the dishes, I politely said goodbye. I kissed my mother, thanked her for dinner, and wished her a happy birthday once more. I greeted Jake, Marcus, and Jessica with appropriate courtesy. "You're leaving early today," my mother observed. "I have work early tomorrow," which is true, but not the real reason. The real reason was that I couldn't stay in that room any longer, breathing that air, pretending that everything was okay.
But my mind was noisy, full of answers I should have given, arguments I should have made, ways I could have defended myself. But deep down, I knew that no answer would have helped. They didn't want to be convinced. They wanted to be right. And for the first time in my life, I decided it wasn't my responsibility to make people respect me. If they thought I was nothing, they were going to find out exactly who I was. I arrived home at 8:30 that night with a clarity of mind that surprised me. You weren't crying. You weren't devastated. You were resolved, as if a complex equation had finally found its solution. I changed my clothes, made some tea, and sat down in my small living room. The apartment was modest but organized and mine. Every piece of furniture had been chosen by me. Every decoration reflected my taste. Here, I didn't have to translate who I was to anyone. At exactly 8:47 a.m., my parents' phone rang. I knew why I was waiting. Mr. Thompson, the chief supervisor at Midwest Logistics, had called me 2 hours earlier while I was still driving home. He urgently needed to speak with me about the distribution center expansion project, a contract my company managed that was entering a critical phase. "Clear,
Sorry to call out of hours, but we have a situation. The system we implemented last week is showing an inconsistency in inventory reports. I need your authorization to proceed with the correction tomorrow morning before it impacts operations. It was a serious but routine situation. I had anticipated this possibility and had the solution ready. But when Mr. Thompson mentioned that he would try to reach me later, I suggested, do you happen to have Robert Mitchell's home number? He's one of the supervisors at your company. I'll be at his family's house until 9 o'clock. My father had spent the entire evening explaining how irrelevant my work was. And now his boss needed my authorization to solve a problem that would directly affect his department. From my apartment, I imagined the scene unfolding on Elm Street. My dad was probably in the living room, still discussing dinner with my mom. Marcus and Jessica might be saying goodbye at the door. Jake might be helping with the dishes, or just relaxing on the couch watching TV. The atmosphere would be one of post-dinner satisfaction, that sense of accomplishment my family always had after successful Sundays. The house would smell of coffee and cake, with traces of conversation and laughter echoing through the rooms. When the phone rang, shattering this domestic peace, it probably caused only mild irritation. A work call on a Sunday night? Who would be inconsiderate enough? I imagine my father walking to the kitchen phone, perhaps complaining quietly about people who don't respect rest times. When he answered, his voice must have carried the polite formality he used for professional matters. Hello, Mitchell family? Robert? This is James Thompson from Midwest. Sorry to bother you on Sunday night. The change in my father's tone must have been instantaneous, from casual irritation to professional respect. Mr. Thompson wasn't just his supervisor, he was the supervisor of all supervisors. I heard your daughter Claire is with you tonight. Could I speak to Mrs. Mitchell? We have an urgent situation with the distribution center expansion project. I can imagine the silence that followed. Not the comfortable lull of conversation, but the disconcerted silence of someone trying to process information that doesn't make sense.
As if it had spoken a foreign language. His daughter, Claire? Why would the boss of his company want to talk to Claire? With Claire, but why would you want to? She's the regional manager responsible for our consulting project at Sterling and Associates. I need her approval to proceed with a critical fix tomorrow morning. I pictured my father's face at that moment, the expression he must have been wearing, brows furrowed, mouth slightly open, the kind of confusion that comes when the world you know suddenly stops making sense. In the living room, Marcus probably heard the strange tone in his father's voice and paid attention. Jake might have looked up from the television. My mother, always attentive to family nuances, surely picked up on the fact that something unusual was happening. She works for you? Not exactly. Sterling consults for us. Claire oversees the implementation of our operating systems. It's a pretty senior position. Claire! My father must have called, his voice carrying an urgency that no one in the family could decipher. But of course, I wasn't there. She's already gone, my mother probably replied from the living room. She left about 20 minutes ago. I can just imagine Mr. Thompson on the other end of the line. Oh, that's too bad. Well, do you have her number? It's about the $500,000 project we're implementing. I need that authorization today. $500,000. The words must have echoed in the kitchen like a silent bomb. My father, who earns an honest but modest salary, who considers a $30,000 sale from Marcus to be impressive, had just discovered that his do-nothing daughter was overseeing a $500,000 project for his company. I have her number, my father must have stammered, but Mr. Thompson, I didn't know she... Robert, your daughter is an exceptional professional. The implementation she has overseen will save us approximately $200,000 annually in operational
Very
efficiency.
proud.
You should be
At
very proud.
9:15, my phone rang. It was my father. Claire, it's me. Mr. Thompson called here looking for you. His voice was different, not the familiar casual tone he always used with me, but something more cautious, almost formal. Yes, he told me he would call. It's about the Midwest project. Claire, a long pause. Why did you never tell me you worked on projects for my company? There were multiple layers to the question. Confusion, sure, but also something that could be interpreted as hurt, as if I had deliberately withheld important information. Dad, I've always tried to explain about my job. You never seemed interested in the details. Another silence, longer this time. He said that you supervise. I'm a regional manager, Dad. I oversee the implementation of management systems for medium and large companies. Midwest has been a client of ours for the past 8 months. Why didn't you say it was so important? The question caught me off guard, not because of the question itself, but because of the tone. There was something about it that I had never heard in my father's voice before when he spoke about me. Something that might have been respect. Mr. Thompson said you're saving them a lot of money, my father continued, as if he was still trying to process the information. It's my job, Dad. It's what I do every day. But I didn't know it was like that. And there it was, the admission I had never expected to hear. My father, the man who had spent decades viewing me as an impractical dreamer, had just discovered that I had a position of real responsibility in the world that he considered important. You never asked for details, I said softly, not as an accusation, but as a simple fact. We we thought it was
He couldn't
just
finish his sentence.
that you
How do
just
you admit to your daughter that you always thought her work was irrelevant? How do you tell her that you spent years belittling accomplishments you never bothered to understand? Dad, I have to go. Mr. Thompson is waiting for my call, and I have to take care of this today. Of course. Of course you must be busy with important things. Important things. Not paperwork or office jokes. Important things. After I hung up, I sat on my couch for a long moment, processing the conversation. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel revenge. I felt relief, like a pressure I'd been carrying around for years had finally been released. On Monday morning, I arrived at the office at 7 a.m. as promised. Midwest system patch went through without a hitch, and by 10 a.m., everything was working perfectly. It was a kind of problem that seems dramatic to the uninitiated, but is commonplace for anyone who works with complex systems. David Chen stopped by my office around 11 a.m. I heard you saved Midwest's weekend yesterday, he commented, leaning against the doorframe. Just doing my job. Your father works there, doesn't he? I had mentioned it casually months ago when we closed the deal. David had an impressive memory for detail. He works. He's a shift supervisor. David looked at me with that shrewd expression I had come to recognize. He didn't need me to explain family dynamics to understand that there was something significant about the fact that I had solved a problem for my father's company. I bet it was an interesting surprise for him to find out what kind of work you really do. You could say that. And how do you feel about that? It was a simple question, but it made me stop. How did I feel? Satisfied? Vindicated? Sad? I feel like I can finally stop trying to translate my life into a language they understand.
David smiled.
I replied after
That's
a
one of the
moment.
most mature answers I've ever heard about family. The changes at home were subtle but undeniable. The following Sunday, when I arrived for our weekly dinner, my father greeted me differently. There was no dramatic transformation. He was still the same person, with the same values and outlook. But there was a new quality in the way he looked at me, something that could be described as consideration. During dinner, when Marcus began to tell me about a particularly good sale, my father interrupted him to ask, "Claire, how's the Midwest project going?" It was the first time in years that he had directed a work question specifically to me during a family dinner. "It's going well. We implemented a new phase last week that should increase the efficiency of the inventory department by about 15%. "That's great," he said, and I could tell he was really listening. "Mr. Thompson said you're doing an excellent job." Marcus and Jake were quiet during this exchange, not hostile, but adjusting, as if they were recalibrating their understanding of who I was in the context of the family. My mother, ever the mediator, smiled proudly. Our Claire was always smart. It was a small but meaningful comment. Wild Claire, an expression of affectionate ownership I hadn't heard in years. The weeks that followed brought small changes that built up into something bigger. Marcus stopped making jokes about my work. He didn't apologize. That would have required admitting that the jokes were cruel in the first place, but he simply stopped. When friends or acquaintances asked about his family, he began mentioning that his sister works on important business projects. Jake, always the most outspoken of the family, came closest to recognizing the change. Over dinner, he said, "You know, Claire, I never really understood what you did. I thought it was just, I don't know, paperwork. And now? Now I know I still don't understand," he laughed.
It was the
"But
closest
I
thing to an
understand that it's
apology I
important."
would get from him, and it was enough. My mom started asking genuine questions about my work. Not the polite, distracted questions she had before, but genuine curiosity about what I did, how projects worked, what kind of companies I served. "It must be a hard job," she once commented. "All those responsibilities." "It is," I agreed, "but it's what I choose to do." "And you're good at it." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of recognition. Months later, my father called me in the middle of a Wednesday. "Claire, it's me. Are you busy?" "Never too busy for you, Dad. What happened?" "Mr. Thompson asked me if you'd be interested in expanding the contract with Midwest. Something about automating more departments." There was pride in his voice, subtle but unmistakable. His boss had mentioned my daughter in glowing terms, and he wanted to tell me. "It is possible. We have the capacity to expand the project." "He said you were exactly the kind of professional they needed for the future of the company." A break. "I didn't know, Claire. I didn't know you were so respected." "Okay. No, let me tell you. I spent years thinking you were wasting your time with these office ideas. I thought real work was just what me and the boys do. But you're doing things I can't even really understand." It was the most honest conversation we had had about my career in my entire adult life. "I just wanted you to see that my work had value," I admitted. "It does, and I'm sorry it took me so long to realize it." My relationship with my family didn't transform into something perfect overnight. We are still fundamentally different people with values and perspectives that don't always align. But something essential
Not the
has
condescending
changed.
respect that is offered to soothe hurt feelings, but the genuine respect that comes from recognition of competence and worth. Today, when I go to Sunday dinners, I don't go with the naive hope that maybe this time they will show interest in my work. I go because I choose to be with my family, knowing that I am seen and valued as I am. Marcus and Jessica got married last fall. During his wedding speech, he mentioned his entire family, including my sister Claire, who manages major projects and has always been the smartest of the three of us. Jake recently asked me for advice on opening his own repair shop. You know business, he said. I need someone who knows how to run these things. My mother now refers to my work with other people as Claire's career in business consulting, a description that shows she's taken the time to understand what I do. And my dad sometimes calls me just to share comments Mr. Thompson makes about my work. Like, you've finally found a way to be proud of me that makes sense in your world. Today, I have a balanced relationship with my family. I love them all, but I no longer depend on their approval to feel valuable. I have learned that some people can only respect what they understand, and some only understand what directly affects their reality. Don't hold a grudge against this limitation. It's simply a human characteristic, like eye color, or a preference for coffee or tea. David Chen was right in that conversation that changed my perspective. I didn't need to prove anything to those who had already decided not to see me. Life proved it to me at the exact moment
I
and in
still
the
go to
exact
Sunday
way
dinners.
I needed.
I still help with the dishes. I still compliment my mother on her cake. I still listen to my brothers tell me stories about their work weeks. But now, they also ask me about my week, and they really listen to the answers. The difference isn't in them, it's in me. I no longer go to the family table carrying a vulnerable hope of recognition. I go carrying the security of someone who knows exactly who they are and what their value is. And if someone questions that value again, well, maybe the phone will ring. Some people ask me if I feel like I got revenge on my family that Sunday night. The answer is no. Revenge implies malicious intent, a desire to cause harm, satisfaction in the suffering of another. That is not what happened. What happened was emotional justice. The truth about who I was and what I did simply came to light in the most natural way possible. I didn't orchestrate the moment. I just didn't interfere when it presented itself. They thought I was nothing. They discovered I was someone they never bothered to know. I didn't have to shout. I didn't have to prove anything dramatically. All it took was the phone ringing at the right moment. The irony is not lost on me. While they spent years trying to convince me that my work was irrelevant, I was, unbeknownst to them, directly affecting my father's professional environment. I was literally contributing to the company that paid his salary. But the real irony is deeper. During all those years of feeling invisible at the dinner table, I was building a solid and respected professional profile. While they were arguing about who had the realest job, I was creating real value for real companies, impacting real jobs,
Life has a
including my own
fascinating sense of
father's.
timing. David Chen was right about many things, but especially about this one. I didn't need to prove anything to those who had already decided not to see me. I spent years trying to translate my professional reality into a language that my family could understand and value, trying to justify my career choice, explain the importance of what I did, demonstrate that office work was real work. What I discovered that night is that some translations are impossible not because the languages are incompatible, but because one of the parties does not want to learn. My family didn't understand my work not because it was too complex, but because they had decided it wasn't important enough to deserve understanding. When they discovered they were wrong, when reality forced a rethink, they quickly adjusted. This taught me something fundamental about relationships. Respect cannot be begged, explained, or negotiated. It either exists naturally or it must be earned through incontrovertible evidence. That night, the evidence presented itself, and I discovered that I would never have to ask to be seen again because I finally knew exactly who I was. Today, when someone tries to belittle my work or question my professional value, I no longer feel that familiar anxiety that accompanied me for so many years. I don't need to defend myself, explain, or justify myself. I just smile. I know who I am. I know what I'm worth. I know the impact my work has on the real world, even when that impact is invisible to those who don't want to see it. And if someone doubts it, well,
Because life
maybe
has
the
this
phone will ring again.
interesting peculiarity. While some people spend energy trying to diminish the value of others, real work continues to happen. Projects are implemented, companies are improved, values are created, problems are solved. Reality doesn't care about opinions about its importance. It simply is. My family learned this in the most direct way possible. I learned something even more valuable, that my peace did not depend on them learning it. They thought I was nothing. They found out I was someone they never bothered to know. I didn't have to scream. I didn't have to fight. I didn't have to get revenge. All it took was for the phone to ring. And today, when I look back, I don't feel anger or resentment. I feel gratitude. Because that night taught me the difference between being seen by others and seeing myself clearly. The second is infinitely more valuable.